Forum Board. For more than 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people have come together to find solutions to our region's biggest challenges. Today, we're a diverse network of people who are eager to learn, connect, and share ideas for a better Oregon. Thank you for joining us at the Sentinel Hotel in downtown Portland, where thousands of people are joining us online, on the radio, and on TV. Live viewers are watching on KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app. Our radio audience is listening via X-Ray FM stations 107.1 FM and 91.1 FM. And TV viewers will watch today's program via Open Signal's community media television stations. We are incredibly grateful for the support of our media partners in bringing City Club forums to our community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, our volunteers and staff enable us to put on Oregon's best civic programming week after week. Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who has made this event possible. Here we are, the second in City Club's three-part series on Oregon's coming financial crisis. We launched this series last month at about the same time that Eco Northwest, North Star Civic Foundation, and Northwest Health Foundation published a report that offered a sobering look at the financial health of Oregon government at all levels, from cities, counties, and school districts to community colleges, water, and fire. We looked at a lot of numbers in that report, and few of them were hopeful. You can read that report online at ournext20.org. Today, we'll hear from 4 exceptional leaders who will help us understand what the numbers mean for their communities. But before we get started, let's refresh our memory from last month's conversation. We learned that Oregon's local schools, cities, counties, and other governments are on the brink of 20 years of increasing financial stress, reaching about $2.7 billion in annual cuts during the worst years. This crisis is the result of a structural imbalance driven in part by an inadequate and inflexible revenue system, particularly after the passage of Measure 5 and 50 property tax restrictions, as well as various cost pressures on state and local budgets. Ultimately, we anticipate that without changes, Oregon governments will continue to see costs grow faster than revenues in future years. The structural imbalance is made worse by the challenge posed by legacy obligations to PERS, Oregon's Public Employee Retirement Savings Plan. We learned last month that the current funding for PERS is to withdraw $30 billion from public services, from schools, cities, counties, and special districts throughout the state over the next 18 years. Key priorities for most Oregonians are provided through those public services. Jesse Beeson called on us last month to view this as a moral problem with both financial and civic aspects to it. And so today, we're going to look more closely at the moral questions that this plan and this challenge raise. Joining us to shine a light on the community impacts of these plans are Duncan Huang, Associate Director at the Apano Communities Fund, where he advocates for Asian and Pacific Islander communities statewide; Reyna Lopez, the Executive Director of PACUN, an organization in Woodburn, Oregon that has advocated for Oregon farm workers and Latinx families since 1985. Katrina Holland, the Executive Director of the Community Alliance of Tenants, where she works to build tenant power and promote a vision of an equitable housing market; and Kali Ladd, a social entrepreneur who is the co-founder of Kairos PDX, a nonprofit charter school dedicated to closing achievement gaps for historically marginalized children. She's also the board chair of Portland Community College. Each of these great leaders will give a 10-minute presentation, and then we'll move to our public Q&A. First up, having won the lottery, is Duncan Huang. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
All right, good afternoon, and thanks for having me back. Last time I was here, I was on a panel entitled YIMBYs, NIMBYs, and what it means to be progressive on housing in Portland. I talked about what it would take to have safe, affordable, and resilient neighborhoods, particularly east of 82nd Avenue. Then I came to the first part of the series last month, and my initial response would have to be bleeped for a radio audience. It was an eye-opening conversation. persistent structural imbalances through 2037, a 6% imbalance in 2035, about 2.7 in annual cuts during the worst years. This is from unfunded actuarial liabilities related to PERS, but also limitations on property taxes, declining federal funds, and other rising costs. At Apano, we work on behalf of Asian Pacific Islander communities statewide and in place-based community development work in East Portland neighborhoods. Last month's conversation seemed to make our jobs a lot harder for decades to come. The neighborhoods we serve have already faced decades of underinvestment. Many streets lack basic infrastructure, such as paved streets, sidewalks, and crosswalks. Our neighbors with young children who now live in affordable housing units above our new offices at 82nd and Division walk across 82nd Avenue, down a high crash corridor on Outer Division, and then turn up a street with no sidewalks to get to school at Harrison Park School. During the winter months, that street is a lake. Lack of trees and other green spaces means that during summer months, a lack of tree canopy and parks and green space means asthma incidents are twice the county average, and temperatures can be 20 degrees hotter than in other parts of the city. Today, my colleagues are going to talk more about impacts of deficits on housing, on education, and in farm worker communities, and underinvestment in our communities and the places we work, live, play are going to be a consistent theme you're going to hear about. In rural communities, the impacts could be absolutely devastating. We heard last month about the potential for lack of sheriff services on weekends, closing of public libraries, and reduction in public health investment. In Multnomah County, however, where we primarily work, the cuts may not seem as obvious. Many cuts in difficult times starts with discretionary programs. County jails may not cut deputies serving those facilities under a certain amount by law, but reentry programs could be cut. After school programs, culturally specific programming, workforce development could all be cut. When we're talking about cuts, it's often not about reducing service levels that will train or serve or educate 6% less people, but whole programs will be eliminated. This is the easiest way for individual departments and local government to reach their austerity goals. The impacts will compound over the next 20 years. In East Portland, which is already a younger and more diverse community, these cuts in services will be particularly impactful. If an immigrant family is unable to access culturally specific job training, and their kids go to school for less time each school year, and they're growing up in unsafe neighborhoods, these will compound over a lifetime. These types of cuts in discretionary programs tear at the social fabric and long-term resilience of our communities. I'd just like to spend the last few minutes here talking about what we're going to do about it by reflecting on Caitlin and Jesse Beeson of Northwest Health Foundation's comments from last month. First, the pivots that we need to make. State to local. So how are local communities taking control and developing shared solutions? The next pivot is biennial to generational. How are we thinking about our community's long-term health rather than just in 2-year budget cycles? And political to civic. How will we ensure our communities are represented in broader decision-making? So these pivots could not be more necessary. Look, our communities have faced underinvestment for decades, in boom times and in tough times. We've had a 10-year economic expansion, and many communities have been left behind. Income disparity is greater now than it was a decade ago. When I think about a lesser pie for the next 20 years and how tough things are gonna be, I also think about the lack of investment in our communities for the past 20 years. And as long as there is a pie, we can and should spend those resources to protect our most vulnerable. Jesse asked us last month to consider what moral duties we owe to each other in his belief that philanthropy needs to invest in and center communities most impacted. Absolutely agree with that. The most important first step is that we cannot allow a budget deficit narrative to allow us to avoid having hard conversation. Sorry, budget cuts is not a valid excuse. Hard conversations requires community organizing and developing new civic leaders to be in the room to advocate for their communities across the state. Why is it that rich neighborhoods have better public health and economic outcomes, It's because they have the privilege to know how a system works. We now need to build that same know-how in our communities, and we've begun to see funders make those shifts. As a result of this, community-based organizations have begun to take increasing leadership in the pivots we need to make. First, we're developing our own local solutions. Last November, the city passed the Clean Energy Initiative. This was created by communities of color with broad-based support that will support workforce development, create green jobs, and increase climate resiliency. Metro passed a regional housing bond with strong community input. These are local funding measures that will get to the heart of our challenges. Second, our organizations are becoming more political. Organizations on this panel include both C3 and C4 organizations. We're gonna vet candidates, we're gonna endorse them, and we're gonna hold them accountable for their promises. I'm not saying the next 20 years are gonna be easy. The current plan to pay for the obligation is really a plan for our communities to pay for it by taking $50 billion out of education, healthcare, and mental health care. We know we need to start a serious conversation about alternative solutions, but this is a conversation that we're ready to have if you're up for it. So thanks for having me.
Great. Can you hear me? I don't usually use podiums because I'm pretty short, so I was just like, I'm going to be like leaning over, nobody can see me. That probably doesn't matter for the radio folks, but for folks in here and on the TV. Hi everyone, I'm Reina Lopez. I'm the executive director of PECUN, Oregon's Farm Worker Union. We represent tree planters and farm workers of the Northwest. And my family is a family of immigrants. I'm a proud daughter of immigrants from Mexico that came here in the 1980s to pick strawberries in the fields in California. And then in '85, we came to Oregon to also join the tree planting industry in the Mid-Willamette Valley. And in 1985, that's around the same time that PECUN got started, when 80 farm workers decided to start their own union to stand up with a mission of taking action against exploitation and all of the effects that come with that, with a vision that someday our families, this radical dream that our families could someday be economically secure enough to take care of ourselves and them as well. And pretty much ever since then, we've been fighting hard for our community. We're based in the Mid-Willamette Valley in Woodburn, Oregon, which is one of the first majority people of color cities in Oregon. It's a small rural town in the heart of the agricultural district of the Mid-Willamette Valley. And ever since our inception, we started to basically try to be the voice and to really empower farm workers, the people who put food on your tables today. And we do that by building a strong movement. A movement that values Si Se Puede, that values dignity and respect for workers, that's pro-immigrant, pro-union, and progressive too. And the reason why I'm here today, PECUN has actually been in this revenue fight for a while. We were actually supporters of the Measure 97 campaign, the corporate tax that would have increased taxes for large corporations to fund education, senior services, and healthcare. And today we continue to be at the table around the Student Success Act and are continuing to be a part of those conversations. This to us is an economic justice issue, and we know that our vision and our perspective that lands at the intersection of race, class, and immigration is essential when we're trying to pass these kinds of policies. And since our inception, we basically got dubbed the moral compass of the legislature. And not only the moral compass of the legislature, but of some of our own best friends, of our coalition partners, of our allies, and of legislators, not just here in the state, but nationally. And that usually means that we're asking people to do the thing that might not be that popular at the time. It means that we're asking people to take the road that's not as easy to take. And it means that we ask you because it's the right thing to do. We know that our presence is necessary because historically, farm workers are the first ones to be left behind when there's the most important policies being passed and being made in Oregon and nationally as well. And we have consistently had to push to have our place at the table. And it means making sure that our members are at informed and engaged at every single decision point when we're trying to pass big policies. And that is the reason why farm workers today are included in big labor policies like paid sick days and when we raise the minimum wage. And that, I think, kind of leads us to where the Student Success Act is today. Not only were we engaged in that conversation, not only did we bring our people to that conversation, but we led on some of those conversations as well. In order to make sure that the most marginalized communities weren't left behind. And I'm really proud and happy to say that we did make a difference. In terms of talking about the tax and the budget structure, we moved a little bit further away from what historically has been an oppressive budget, a budget that continuously hurts Latinos and low-income families. And today, the Student Success Act took one step forward in making sure that we made it a little more equitable, asking corporations to pay a little bit more so students can be successful. And I'm even more proud to say that in that conversation, we ensured that we were funding culturally specific programs where Brown, Black, and Indigenous people were taken into account, that those got funded, and to ensure that we got a little bit closer to making sure that the racism and the oppression that our kids face every day in schools is a little bit less as well. But as we know, our work is not done. That was a tough fight, as you all saw in the news. And it's not enough, right? That's why we're here today, because we need to make significant investments in our systems, and it's not gonna take one day. It's not gonna take just one ballot measure. It's not gonna mean one session. It's really a long-term fight that we all need to be a part of. And PECUN believes that we can do this through strong coalitions, where people can speak truth to power to each other, and where we agree that we're not gonna get pitted against each other. We know that this unfunded liability on PERS, it complicates things a little bit, right? But I wanna call us all to find solutions that aren't gonna leave our school janitors and our lunch ladies behind. As a pro-worker organization, we do believe fundamentally that our elders need to be taken care of, and that every single worker deserves to retire with dignity and with respect. But I'll tell you, most of the elders that I'm working with, they don't even have that, right? They are depending on their Social Security that's gonna be coming in, or some of them worked all their lives without papers, and they aren't gonna get to benefit from any of those things. Or they have very little to nothing left in their savings because they had to use that to basically take care of their families and survive. I want to say that this doesn't mean that we need to be pitting it against our cities, right? Ensuring that our cities and our counties have funding is essential in creating the economic justice that our communities need to thrive. But we should not do this on the backs of working people, and we should come together to do more revenue reform and to make sure that and ensure that at the top of that priority list that our cities and our counties are fully funded. I also want to call us to action to work to raise revenue together and ensure that the system is progressive, that it's equitable, and that we're not repeating the same mistakes of the past. Because it seems like we want to keep doing that, right? So that it truly addresses the issues that are going on in our community, and that it shifts us, literally, culturally shifts us from this culture of scarcity that we're seeing constantly in Salem to a culture of abundance. Because our economy here in Oregon has been growing. It's been growing. People are moving here, people are spending money, but yet the investments in the public good are at an all-time low. And the little investments that have been made, again, are being fronted by the people that are always asked to give up more, working people, working families. Just to give you a sense, the average member at PECUN, the average salary of a member at PECUN is $20,000 a year. And for us, if there was an increase in property taxes, if there was an increase in something that was directly affecting our families, it means, again, that we're playing into this oppressive system where we're asking the people who have the least to give the most. We believe that in order to pass big revenue reform, in order to make this game-changing changes and investments, we all need to work together. I think that the Student Success Act was a good example of how we came at the table. We worked hard to make that happen. That's important to our members. But there's a lot of other things that every single person at this table feels that is important. They're important investments to make, and they need to be made publicly. One of those things that our members, that we've been hearing more and more from the farm worker community, is around childcare. And one of the big ideas that we've been having is how could we have a comprehensive universal childcare system here in Oregon? Because today Oregon ranks as one of the most expensive places to get childcare. For who has their kid in daycare these days? We got some folks in daycare. I saw the stats, $12,000 to $14,000 a year for daycare. I think that was tuition at like OSU when I was going to college. And we continue to see that most counties are childcare deserts. And for my community, I'll tell you one thing, none of us are using the childcare system. We're not going to daycares. A lot of our families actually use a more informal system, a system that involves very underpaid, low paid, or no paid aunties and friends that are doing our moms a solid, basically. And when we talk about this is probably one of the most important things that we can talk about that is at the intersection of gender and race and class that we could do to really change outcomes for families. The other thing I want to talk about too is paid family and medical leave. And I want to give that as an example because this is something that's going to cost us money at the front end. Even though there is a system that we're figuring out, it's going to cost us money at the front end. Today, farm workers are the least likely to have paid family and medical leave. Our moms do not have the option of taking paid or protected time off when they're going to have a baby. And that's just not fair. But the way that we were able to pass the Student Success Act and also make sure that paid family leave wasn't pitted against it was that we were working together every single step of the way. And that was thanks to the Fair Shot Coalition. So shout out to Fair Shot, if there's any of y'all in the room. So as a society, I want to say, what are we doing to walk our talk around economic justice at the intersection of race, class, and immigration too, because that's what I represent. For us, it's similar to what Duncan has said. It's about building a voice. It's about building a movement. And for us, building a voice means being a key part of that conversation. Today and decades ago, PECUN decided that we were going to try to increase representation in these spaces, that it wasn't that common to see a farm worker, a brown person, a poor person, an immigrant person in these spaces. But the way that we've been able to do that is, number one, the most central part, the heart of it, organizing, grassroots organizing around issues, around lobbying, around whatever we can organize around, but making sure that we're together and building community around that. Building a voice through elections. That's huge. That's accountability to our elected officials. And we're talking to the people that nobody's talking to, Latinx families, bilingual, biculturally, people who are voting for the very first time, and talking to them about what being a pro-farm worker organization means and what it could mean for our state. Building community and providing direct services to the members that we have that need it the most, because we know that we have those too, and we got to be there for them. And at the core of it, developing our leaders and centering our stories around that, which historically have been used against us, right? But instead, we're turning that around and using our stories to be the core of our strength. So I think that, how much time do I got? Am I done? Am I good? I'm wrapping up. Okay, so, to just conclude, building strong alliances and coalitions is really important in this. We need to bring labor together with business. We need to bring social justice organizations together with other organizations that don't focus on social justice so that we can actually make these changes that we need to make. And, as the old saying goes, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and historically we have been on the menu. But I'm telling you right now that using a lot of these tactics that, Duncan's talking about, that my girls are going to be talking about too, basically, we have been leading some of these conversations, and it's made a real big difference. So thank you for your time. Si se puede.
Hello, everybody. My name is Katrina Holland. I serve as Executive Director of Community Alliance of Tenants and Interim Board President of our C4 arm that was launched in 2018 called CAT Action. So we essentially organize renters in their homes and in public spheres to be able to be at the table to make decisions that really impact them. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of what unfunded liabilities may mean. So here's a fancy chart, and it basically describes that at the end of the day, when it comes to the responsibilities for providing housing services, and that's including some of this organizing and leadership development work that Reina and Duncan have been talking about, it really does rely on federal dollars and on local dollars. The state gives a little bit, and I'll go into that a little bit more, but for the most part, it looks like that. And this is not a real chart, it just looks really nice on a PowerPoint. If we go to the next slide, this is actually what a real chart looks like for the city of Hillsborough. So the blue represents federal dollars, which is approximately 700,000 something. The yellow represents others, and then that little teeny tiny sliver is interest earnings for their affordable housing fund. That was approximately $1 million plus. So at the end of the day, local governments and federal dollars are primary drivers of housing assistance and support to families in the local space. Now, I know people are going to ask, what about OHCS, Oregon Housing Community Services? Yes, the state plays a role helping to fund programs like EHA, SHAP, and funding capital projects with financing opportunities through OHCS. But again, the real bulk of supports for individuals from homelessness prevention and transition, getting people off the streets and into housing, housing supportive services that deal with mental health, addiction, and other things, housing vouchers for public housing, ongoing rent assistance programs like Section 8, now called Housing Choice Vouchers, even up to first-time home ownership opportunities, refinancing assistance, and housing retention are largely provided by local dollars and federal dollars, counties, cities, Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. So if we think about the previous conversations that we've had and about what these unfunded liabilities and their impacts do to local governments, and if we combine the economic revenue projection released earlier this week that projected growth, but slower growth, fewer in-migrants, and less natural population booms due to births and deaths, we have a recipe for disaster. We really do. One of my amazing colleagues in the field, Israel Bayer, says it best. If we think we have a homelessness problem now, just wait. Federal investment in housing supports has dwindled significantly over the past decade, or over the past several decades. As the National Low-Income Housing Coalition puts it, no significant investment in new housing affordable to the lowest income people has been made in more than 30 years, and a great shortage of housing affordable to that population has been in a perpetual state of shortage for decades. Since the creation of the Section 8 programs in the early 1970s, no new federal program has the deep income targeting necessary to meet the needs of people with the greatest housing affordability burdens. The Urban Institute says that renter housing needs have grown substantially. They put out a report in 2017, almost totally, because of unaffordably high rents rather than physical deficiencies, and federal housing assistance is simply not keeping up, so local governments in the state have to step in. The number of low-income renters that actually receive federal housing assistance has dropped notably as a fraction of the low-income housing households that need it. Since 1974, the only creation of federal housing dollars to support local governments in meeting the housing needs of residents, especially low-income people, was the creation of the National Housing Trust Fund, which was allocated, listen to this, $267 million in 2018 for the entire nation. And this year, in 2019, it's been allocated $248 million less. Oregon was allocated approximately 3.4 for the entire state. Now let's scale that up and think about investments if you include federal investments from HUD awards and appropriations in 2018 that include community development block programs, continuum of care allocations, emergency solutions grants, home investment partnerships allocations, housing trust funds allocations, and HOPWA. Oregon's total investment in these types of funds was $62 million. Again, for the entire state in 2018. For the entire nation, That's a quick slide of what that looks like. For the entire nation, it was $5.5 billion. Yes, you heard that right. The entire nation, $5.5 billion. Now, granted, yes, we have programs like LIHTC, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credits, thanks to the 1986 Tax Reform Acts, that offers incentives to build affordable housing. And according to Novoco.com, estimated tax credits to be allocated in 2019 is just under $13 million for Oregon. Additionally, let's talk about the truth about LIHTC. Affordable housing opportunities do not often go to where the need is greatest. Amongst families who make somewhere between 0 to 30% of our area median income. Governor Brown's budget alone was over $300 million for the 2019-2021 biennium for the entire state. And if you combine those resources and think about a small city like Hillsborough, where homelessness is increasing, they had a total budget of $1 million for 2018 in their affordable housing fund, the majority of which, thinking back to that slide, was designated for capital outlay, and the majority of which came from federal funds. Again, we have a recipe for disaster. Now I'll stop here. There are people way smarter than me in this room who have way more information, expertise, and knowledge. But bottom line, relying on the feds to continue carrying the burden, especially in the face of unfunded liabilities and responsibilities local governments have, is not a solution. So let's talk about what life may look like for a housing unstable family in Oregon. Uh-oh. Of course. So I'd like you to meet two friends of mine. This is Hannah and Esau and their little baby. They are an African-American family in Portland, Oregon that reflect the 2017 American Community Survey estimates of what an African-American family's housing demographics are said to look like. Yes, there is an undercount, we know that, but bear with me. Family income is said to be approximately $52,000 a year combined. Please note that that is family income, not household income, which is closer to $30,000 in Portland. And their rent is about $1,282 a month. They're lucky. They're just missing rent burden status. They make about 3.4 times the rent. We'll catch up. I want to give you a brief snapshot of their budget. So they found some pretty sweet deals. They make out okay at the end of the month. They have a net surplus of about $140. But then they get a 13% rent increase just before SB 608 passed. Woohoo! And now they've just hit rent burden status, and they're in the red $30 a month. So like any family, they start evaluating what they can cut. This or this. Here are some choices that we hear families debate as we serve folks at CAT. So we have a hotline. We serve about 2,000 to 3,000 renters. We do some building-based organizing. So they talk about cutting food budgets. They talk about going to the doctor less. They talk about perhaps going to work less so that they don't have to pay as much for childcare. But eventually, they decided that they're going to get on an income-driven repayment plan for their school loans. So it means they're in debt longer, but hey, they make out okay. They have a net gain of about $260 a month. Oh no. Oh boy. There we go. Okay. So let's layer on some well-known socioeconomic conditions for African-American families. Inflammation-related diseases, well-documented phenomenon amongst many communities of color, and low birth weight. So for their baby, they decide to get fortified formula, more frequent checkups for the baby that do not qualify as well-child checks under insurance. Well, they just hit the red again, negative $39 a month. Hannah then deals with some blood pressure issues. Not too bad. She just ends up getting hospitalized because it just stays up there for a little bit. She gets on a drip. She's monitored for a day or two. It's not necessarily that bad. She's okay, but they get slapped with a hospital bill of $3,400 and monthly medication expenses, which averages to about $150 per month. Time to go back to the drawing board again. What are we going to cut? Well, they decide definitely can't count on doctor because the baby needs it and Hannah needs it. Esau definitely can't go to work less because Hannah needs some flexibility. They already exhausted the income-driven repayment plan, so they cut their food budget. That's something that we hear from families all the time. I'm sure you see where this is going. a move is necessary, or perhaps they may end up homeless. One life mishap, and this delicate dance is interrupted. And eventually they have to consider moving, or maybe they consider help with services. So since we're talking about services, let's imagine Hannah and Esau decide to get services. They get help. Let's go to the next slide. They decide to get into the safety net. So they get some rent assistance, not too much, $160 a month. They decide to get utility assistance, $40 for 12 months. They decide to get on an income-driven repayment plan with the hospital, and the ambulance thankfully writes off part of their balance. For one family alone, that just cost $12,883, because they also decide to get support from an organization like Join to move, which costs $7,000 for placement and deposit assistance. Now let's scale this up. If just under 4 in 10 Oregonians are renters, that's approximately 1.4 million people. Data suggests that over half of renters are rent burdened. 51%, families just like Hannah and Esau. As a matter of fact, every house district across the state is rent burdened, with particular concentrations of more than 50% in some counties. In every unified district except one, in Oregon, over 40% of children's households are rent burdened, which makes sense. We have the highest rate of child homelessness in the nation. Break this down even further, there is disproportionate representation of renter families making up renter households. Here's what it looks like to be exact. Over 30% of renters in all of Oregon are people of color, yet we only make up 1 in 10 people in Oregon. So over half of Oregon's renter population is on the brink and could need housing supports from local governments, from federal, from the state, from one life mishap. These folks are more likely to be families with children, people of color. Cuts to housing services would have devastating impacts on these communities. And if federal resources are dwindling, and in some cases make up a large portion of housing supports, with the rest mostly using their own general fund dollars or revenues, and local governments will be facing budget shortfalls as a trickle-down effect from the state's unfunded liability, you do the math. Again, we have a recipe for disaster. And what we know based on the data is we're gonna take the hit the most. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Does this go up? All right, I get to close you out today after you've eaten a big meal and you're feeling a little drowsy. I get to talk a little bit more. My name is Kali, and as was mentioned, I'm co-founder of Kairos PDX, and Kairos has a mission of closing opportunity and achievement gaps, and we have been involved in the PERS conversation because the failure to address PERS has an astronomical impact on both achievement and opportunity. It's not a matter of if, but when. It's not whether or not it's a possible thing that we need to solve, but a probable and actual thing that we need to solve. I'm in the business of humans, not numbers, so I'm not going to talk about the financial analysis. I'm going to focus on the human cost. The dividend we pay, either through intention or neglect, will be felt for years. This is the dividend that stares us in the face right now. Now, in education, many of you already know what this means. It means larger class sizes. It means shorter school years. It means we don't have the paraprofessionals to support our students with special needs. It means that we're at the bottom in the country for high school graduation rates. This is our reality now. And even with a revenue bill passing, if we don't address PERS, it will remain our reality. As I thought about what I wanted to say here, I kept coming back to the words of a well-known leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And while it's somewhat cliche to quote Dr. Martin Luther King, I couldn't get his words out of my mind, and it's from the letter from a Birmingham jail. Because in that letter, he calls out people on their mediocrity. And so I'm going to read a portion of that letter right now, and I would just ask that you sit and hear his words, though I am not the orator that he was. He says, "First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goals you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, and who lives by a mythical concept of time and constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. He said, I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. In this context, here in Oregon, I believe that King's words ring true. And I would dare substitute the word moderate for white liberal, or even just Oregonian. Here's the same text with my edits. The Oregonian who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I would agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods, with your taxes, who paternalistically believes he or she can set the timetable for another man, another woman, or another child's freedom. I say these things because I believe they are true, and as a liberal black woman who believes in justice and knows that economic progress is meager at best for people of color, and knows how important our public institutions like our K-12 schools and our community colleges are for this community, I side with King. As someone who experiences the shackles of marginalization, but also at the policy level, works at tables and sees that in our rural areas that are also shackled with poverty, they stand to experience even more crushing forces due to our PERS debt. I stand with King for them. And as someone who sees that Oregon itself is dangerously close to creating structured dams that block the flow of social progress in this state, I side with King. You see, the PERS problem is not a numbers problem. It is a human problem. It is a whole cities in this state going bankrupt problem. It is not just a teacher's problem. It is the shackling on the backs of our youngest, most vulnerable populations, our debt problem. It is the schools that are supposed to be the great equalizer being decimated problem. It is community colleges not being accessible to communities problem. It is making the poor poorer problem. And as all of you heard here, it has an impact on every social service that we offer, from housing to mental health to jobs. It is a $26 billion imbalance problem. And most importantly, it is a now problem. It is not a tomorrow problem. It can't be a tomorrow problem, because if it is, it means it's my 7-year-old's problem, or maybe their children, your children and grandchildren. And as King said, who are we to set the timetable for another child's freedom? The current plan as it stands is to pay for it by withdrawing $50 billion from public services over the course of the next 20 years. And that's coming out of all of these budgets. And it's basically saying, dear child, dear houseless man or woman, dear college student, or dear hard worker trying to start your own business, you don't matter. I reject your humanity, and I reject your striving towards the American dream of education and economic freedom, the American dream of a living wage job and a decent place to call home. This is what our current plans suggest. An alternative plan is to delay action, extend the terms of our debt, and have this same conversation in 10 and 20 and 30 years. I'd argue that neither is suitable nor is neither honorable. We need to take drastic steps to do something radically different. Now is our time, Oregon, and I'm part of this community, to do something bigger and bolder than what can be done, than what is being proposed. We, I think, are at a special moment in time and at a crossroads, and I think that if we choose a path that involves something that may be uncomfortable, we will see progress. Martin Luther King Jr. also said, I of course have to end with him because I love him. Dr. Martin Luther King said, human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men and women willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. The time is always ripe to do right. And now is to make true and real the promise of democracy and transform our pending Oregon elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood and sisterhood. So, I believe King's words are as applicable now as they were then, and my question to all of you is, can we hear them? Will we heed them? The answer rests on all of our shoulders, because otherwise we do know how this story ends. Thank you.
For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Colin Jones, president of City Club. We're talking about Oregon's fiscal crisis and its impact on communities. We just heard from Duncan Wong, associate director of Apano Communities Fund, Reina Lopez, executive director of Pecun, Katrina Holland, executive director of the Community Alliance of Tenants, and Khalil Ladd, co-founder of Kairos PDX. In a moment, we'll go to audience questions, but if we could get one more round of applause for all four panelists. Thank you. Everyone watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question on an index card, now is a good time to hold it up high for City Club staff to collect. You may also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. City Club members who would like to ask a question at the mic, please identify yourself as a member, the mic is over here, and ask one question in 30 seconds or less. I always encourage you, if you'd like your first sentence to be a question, that is a great idea and an excellent approach. Let's start.
Hello, I'm Roberta Palmer, City Club member. I feel that Oregon needs a goods and services tax yesterday, and that would help close the revenue gap. And how do we justify a, quote, regressive tax? Well, it's because the poor and the low income benefit much more from services than they do from tax systems. And the Europeans have found that out. They have very low poverty rates compared to us, and particularly Oregon. And of course, that should be part of a reform package with income tax and the—
Is a question coming?
Yes, and how do you feel about that?
Excellent. Sales taxes, who wants to take it? Nobody. Seize the day, Katrina.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you. Yes, I think we need to look at taxes. I think we need to look at, there are ways to do taxes less regressively, and I think we need to explore them. I think we clearly need more revenue, so, yeah.
It's a complicated question and a complicated answer. I agree with Kelly. There's definitely a way to implement taxes in a way that aren't as regressive and end up on the backs of the lowest income people and communities of color. I think that there are, as you stated earlier, there are a bunch of other tax measures that we need to look at, including businesses who need to pay their fair share.
Hi, I'm Bobby Regan, City Club member. With the passage of the Student Success Act, with new funds for K-12 education, and assuming that most of that new revenue doesn't go to pay down our PERS obligations, what, in your opinion, in terms of your own communities, what are the ways that our local school districts across Oregon should specifically spend those funds to have the most impact for our students?
That's a big question. I mean, are you saying separately from what has been laid out in the the bill that just got passed?
That were laid out, but are there some specific strategies where you have seen really positive outcomes for communities of color and poor Oregonian kids in particular in terms of helping them graduate from college ready for career or their next steps?
Sorry, one thing that I think that is strong about what was passed is a recognition of the role of community-based organizations and culturally specific organizations in the educational infrastructure. It's easy to say, well, they're not schools, let us do the job of schools, but schools can't do it all. They don't have the infrastructure or the knowledge all the time to support diverse families that they're serving. And we have many school districts that have seen shifts in their demographics and struggle to connect with both the child and the family, and both are necessary to really support children's success in school. So I think partnership, anything that brokers partnership with community-based organizations and sort of the intellectual knowledge that these organizations bring, the lived experience and wisdom that they bring, I think will make our systems stronger. I think that's true across the state where you have different demographics of folks. I often hear people in different parts of Oregon say, well, we don't have culturally specific organizations, but there are community-based organizations that understand the diverse communities, and diverse communities are throughout our state. And so that is, I think, a very important thing if we're going to see improvement in outcomes for children.
Thank you all so much for your comments today. My question for you is a community organizing question. It's a how do we get there question. During this legislative session, it seems like we're going to have solved about half of Oregon's financial problem, which leaves the harder hill yet ahead. How do we include the voices of communities that are most impacted in doing this next stretch of work, particularly since, as you've so beautifully laid out, it is problem solving that has a real moral dimension. It's about sacrifices today and sacrifices for our kids and our grandkids. How do we do it? How do we get those voices into the problem solving spaces?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and today we really framed the potential impacts in our communities, like in education and health, public health. But I think the answer is really about how are we going to invest in long-term capacity building within communities. Having a budget conversation is difficult. We're talking about billions of dollars, multiple funding mechanisms. It is extremely difficult for our community to be able to be in the same room and understand those issues and talk about them meaningfully. So I think it's the role of philanthropy and government to really invest in civic engagement and leadership development. We need new voices and we need new leaders. That needs some intentionality behind it.
Definitely agree with what Duncan said. I would add that not only do we have to look at investment and capacity building for most impacted leaders, but we also need to think about it over a long term and possibly think about doing so in unconventional ways. So for example, the census is coming up. What does it mean for us, for philanthropy and government institutions to think about the ways in which we will be knocking on doors anyway to educate folks on different issues that we're facing, conversations that we need to be having, and then plugging folks into leadership development opportunities to understand and to meaningfully participate in these conversations. Because I'll just be honest, we've been doing leadership development for over a decade now, and it is very clear that when folks don't use the same language, when folks don't use the same jargon, you don't get viewed as a credible knowledge base in the room and at the table. And even though you're sitting at the table, you still end up on the menu, and that's a problem. And it doesn't happen in 30 days. It doesn't happen in a year. It takes significant time, relationship building in multiple ways, in multiple intersecting ways. And so, yeah.
Can I say one other thing? I think we need to get diverse people on the other side of the equation. When we talk about investment, we tend to talk about the impacts. On the investment portfolio side, and it's the financial side that I don't spend a lot of time in, but what I am understanding is that we take a lot of money outside of Oregon when we invest, and it doesn't help our communities in Oregon. Imagine if we had investments that were centered here in Oregon, and it actually reinforced the things that we value around climate change and livability. Like, we don't have the voices of people of color on that side of the issue. And I think it is a miss, and I think it is part of what is hurting sort of the entire conversation.
Thank you for some truly dynamic presentations. How do we recruit support amongst the people who will pay the additional taxes that are needed to provide for Oregon in an atmosphere in which distrust of government at every level is endemic?
Wow.
Drop the mic.
That is such a big question, but I think that this is so long term. This is such a long-term conversation, and I think that even our own members have criticized us if we do actually come to the table with, a Nike or an Intel to say, hey, let's have a conversation, let's meet somewhere in the middle, and let's try to actually talk. But that's what it takes. I mean, for many, many years, for example, the Farm Bureau was a group of folks that I would say we probably wouldn't have been on the same side of issues at all. And today, we're actually fighting at the table together for driver's licenses. I was just in DC supporting Tom Nasser in a negotiations meeting around a blue card bill, who historically the United Farm Workers was not always on the same side of. And we're supporting some of those folks too around making sure that we have farm worker housing tax credits. And that's been many years of fighting with each other and then coming back together, sitting at the table and talking to each other. And I really feel like that is what it's gonna take. That's 30 years of fighting with each other, talking to each other, and coming to the table with each other, and then having a mutual respect for each other. Which means, if you think about like just what kind of started some of those conversations maybe 7 years ago, we still have a ways to go to get there, I think, with the business, with large corporations, with the wealthiest folks in the state.
So in some ways, this has been a very dispiriting program. We focused a lot on the impacts of the looming crisis. I'm wondering if we can close out sort of as concisely as possible. What gives you hope right now when you sort of look forward? What makes you think that there might be a solution or a better way, or that the future for the next generation might be stronger, in like 1 or 2 sentences? Yes, please.
Oh, okay. These people give me hope. And I would also say that young people give me hope. I'm like, damn. Sorry, can I say that? I'm like, dang, young people. I think that these are the types of conversations we need to have to start the conversation, right? And for me, I do truly believe in the value of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, that we can do it. Si se puede.
Perfect.
Yeah, ditto. I think, I'm just so inspired by our young folks. People say they're a future, but really they're the now. I think they're really leading the way. Yeah, Raina and I used to share an office just like a few years ago, and our organizations were pretty tiny. But I think, you know, like a lot of the community-based organizations have grown to meet the needs of our communities. That really gives me hope because we have, you know, more infrastructure, more capacity. You know, we're holding electeds accountable, and we're here to stay.
I think I'm encouraged by a lot of things. I'm definitely encouraged in sort of the movement of community-based organizations to expand our horizons beyond just service provision and leadership development into holding electeds accountable, because that's obviously going to be one of the biggest points or one of the biggest intersections where we're having these dialogues. I'm also encouraged by the fact that we're having this conversation here. I can say that, you know, in the renter world or renters' rights world, we've been focusing so hard on policy like SB 608 and other tenant protections in local jurisdictions, and it seems like everywhere we go, whether we're talking at the intersection of housing and education, or talking at the intersection of housing and community programs for communities of color, or intersection of housing and labor, everybody's having this conversation about this unfunded liability and what responsibilities we have and what sacrifices we're willing to make. So that gives me hope, because we all know history has shown that when we put our heads together and we come to the table, we do solve problems.
Okay. Hope. I think, you know, I was thinking about the fact that my husband's a native Oregonian or a native Portlander, and people often call him a unicorn because so many people come to this state because they love Oregon, they love what Oregon has to offer. And I think my hope is the love that people here have for the state of Oregon. The state of Oregon is at risk of being the Oregon that we love if we don't do anything. And I think my hope is that people love this community and this state enough to take action, because we cannot protect the things we love about this state if we don't take action to do something. So that is my hope.
We are so grateful for everyone who made today's forum possible. Thank you to Andrew Kollick for producing, to Caitlin Baggett-Davis for your ideas and guidance, and to all of our speakers. One more round of applause and we are adjourned.